The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
And welcome to BronxTalk. Since it was proposed in February, the idea of having Fresh Direct relocated to the Harlem River rail yards in the South Bronx has brought on a vigorous debate. Questions have arisen about the use of the land, the more than $125 million in public subsidies, and the ultimate value of available jobs. In fact, tonight's guests have filed suit against the project, citing environmental concerns and, more recently, contentions of unfair trade practices, among other issues. We will examine the entire project tonight. Our guests are an attorney involved in the suit as well as a community advocate. Also, if you have questions or comments, then feel free to call in. Phones are open at 718-960-7241. You can also email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Before we begin tonight, please note that weeks prior to scheduling tonight's show, we had invited Fresh Direct's Bronx consultant, Majora Carter, to appear on Bronx Talk to offer the company's point of view and a perspective on their plans in the South Bronx. After a number of phone calls, texts, and emails, the majority of which were not responded to, our request was finally denied. And we received this response from her office. They said to us, she prefers to wait until her work on the Fresh Direct project yields some more results before doing an interview. The hope is that waiting a bit longer will enable her to really have something to talk about that builds on what the borough president has put out there and demonstrate clearly that her client is continuing to follow through on its commitment to the Bronx, etc., in ways that directly contradict the claims made by other guests on your show and elsewhere. So editorially, I will tell you that this is a disappointing stance. If you believe in what you're doing, then you talk about it. No better place to talk about it than here. To me, this attempt is about manipulating the discussion rather than engaging in a direct and open dialogue. It's a concept we fundamentally reject. It is a shame they have not been on the show yet. And it's also a shame that they're not here tonight, and I'm sorry for that. So on that unfortunate note, we do begin tonight by welcoming the director of the environmental program of the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Mr. Gavin Carney. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And also from South Bronx Unite, is Reverend Ruben Austria. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you.
Mr. Carney, let's start with you. Let's just roll through it here. Fresh Direct is promising jobs. They're going to be utilizing an unused part of the Bronx, filling it with development and industry. They'll be accepting food stamps. They'll provide their services now to the entire borough. And they say they'll convert to an environmentally sound truck fleet. Win, 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 win. These are all code words and catchwords that people in the Bronx would say, we like it. What's the problem?
Yeah, well, there's a few different problems here. I think the key word in your question is promises. So there's what is Fresh Direct committed to, and what are they promising to do in a way that has some teeth to it. So some fundamental issues with the development. One, it's announced as a done deal before the public has any opportunity to comment on it. It's a patently anti-democratic process. The mayor, the governor, the borough president come out publicly, say, we're going to subsidize this deal to the tune of $127 million 2 days before they accepted any public testimony, and the only public testimony that they've received on the project to date. The second issue with it is they did a severely truncated environmental assessment. They didn't look at the fact that this project is going to create about 1,500 diesel truck trips in the South Bronx every day. And they didn't seriously look at the fact that it's going to generate another 2,000 to 3,000 car trips every single day in a community with high asthma rates, with cardiovascular disease that's very susceptible to these kinds of impacts.
Now, these car trips are different from the truck trips that they say they will ultimately convert to an environmentally friendly fleet.
Here's what they're saying about the trucks and their commitment to a green fleet. There's nothing right now other than a small grant to hire a small number of electric trucks, which they don't have yet. There's no commitment to a green fleet. What they're dangling out there as a way of generating support for the project is, well, we're thinking about natural gas at some point down the road. And if you look at the memorandum of understanding that they signed with the borough president, it's we intend to do this. If you look at their papers in the context of the litigation that we filed, it's a similar kind of wishy-washy commitment. So there's no green truck fleet commitment. And I would point out that in the past, when they've gotten heat about the truck issues generating from their business, they've said the same thing. And they said, well, support us now. Down the road, we're really interested in converting to a green fleet.
You mentioned natural gas, but the borough president was here on the show and said Smith Electric is now in the Bronx and that they were going to convert to an electric fleet. So that would be part one of my question. The second part of it is the bottom line here trust, that you just don't believe what they say, even though these contentions are being made at very high levels?
I think it's a couple of things. So the electric truck thing. So they got a grant for 10 electric trucks. They have a truck fleet that's in the order of 200 to 300 trucks, and they're making 1,500 truck trips a day. Now, if they had done a proper environmental analysis, they could have said, yeah, we're going to generate all this diesel truck traffic, and we're going to offset it with however many trips of electric trucks. They didn't do that. So now we know they have 10, which works out to about 5% of their total truck fleet is going to be electric at some point in the future. No commitments around natural gas. The other thing is, you ask about whether this is a matter of trust. Trust isn't the way you do these kinds of deals. There's no trust that's involved between the city and Fresh Direct about the subsidies. There are firm commitments that they're making around the subsidies. If you want the communities to support a deal, if you want the deal to be real, to be meaningful, it's not trust, it's commitments, and that's how things get done. You don't have one standard when you're working with the city and reaching a deal with the city, and another standard when you're talking to the community and you're just making promises and talking about your aspirations.
Reverend Austria, let's bring you into the dialogue. Now, you live in the community, and again, we've had the borough president on, and certainly the dialogue that's out there in the media, we all know what it says. And basically it's saying this is an impoverished community, and we need jobs. We need to get people jobs. There may be some sacrifices we have to make. What is your issue, a large issue with this? And I know that you are one of the complainants in the legal action as well. But tell me, in your own words, what's your issue with this?
Well, I think number one is the impact on the community's health. And you look at our neighborhood, and our asthma rates are about 8 times the national average. I think you could go to pretty much any household in the South Bronx, and probably any parent would tell you, at least half of my kids have asthma. And when you think about the addition of whether it's 2,000 truck trips, as Fresh Direct has stated, or as we've looked at the numbers, likely to be even more with employee vehicular traffic, that severe impact on the environment, even to the level where the pollutants that they're now measuring, these micro pollutants that were not even part of, those weren't even on the radar in the environmental impact study that Fresh Direct referred to back in 1993. The environmental impact study that they looked at was 20 years old, and there's been since a whole lot of more residential development in that neighborhood. But as a resident of that neighborhood, as somebody who works there, somebody who really hopes to raise kids there, and I think about the effect on children's lungs and the asthma, and to bring it back to the jobs. Yes, there's some jobs potentially coming in. There's actually zero guarantee of jobs for Bronxites. But think about this for a second. The kids who have asthma in the South Bronx, any parent will tell you that their kids miss any number of days of school for asthma hospitalizations. And you think about kids who would miss school for asthma, fall behind further educationally, not be able to make it to college, and then what type of jobs do they qualify for? Probably these $8 an hour Fresh Direct jobs.
Well, we'll break down the jobs in just a moment. Well, what should be on that land? You live in that neighborhood. We took pictures and put all that on the air in the past. What do you think should be down there?
Yeah, well, I look at this beautiful mural right here, and you see
this is of the Harlem River, a little further up north.
Yeah, but you see the water, and I really believe there's a beautiful both mental and physical health benefit just to being able to go into the water, right, or to be near the water. And you go down to this area, you've already got a waste management plant, you've got FedEx, you've got the New York Post. And basically, even when we try to go in that area, security guards are telling us, we can't enter the premises. I would love to see people be able to take their kids down there for bike rides.
The response that I've gotten, and I've presented this on this show and a couple of times, the response I've gotten to that is, but you know what? If people have jobs, they will be less poor. And that's, even though nobody is underestimating that value, there is something to be said for that.
I mean, there's no secret that we need jobs in the South Bronx, one of the highest unemployment rates. But when I think about a project like this, that the types of jobs that it's offering are about $8 an hour, not enough to live on. You're going to have to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to make a living wage. Right? There's no commitment to living wage. And again, I think about this $127 million of subsidies. And it's like, if you're going to get that much public money for a project, and you're going to still pay people at the cheapest possible rate, it just doesn't add up for something that's going to develop our community.
I want to get back to the land thing, but since we've been talking about jobs, let me just put out exactly what Fresh Direct has said. This was put out in October. They announced plans to hire at least 200 new employees for various positions over the next 3 months. They expect Bronx residents will fill many of those positions. They currently employ nearly 500 workers from the Bronx. Company hopes to create up to 1,000 new jobs in addition to its current 2,400 member workforce once its new state-of-the-art facility is operational, with no limit to the number that ultimately can go to residents of the Bronx. The new positions they hope to fill will include approximately 75 plant jobs, including sortation, shipping, and kitchen positions, as well as 125 transportation jobs, including delivery associates and drivers. And I know there's unemployed people who are listening going, wow, I'd love a job like that. Hourly plant and transportation employees have worked at the companies who work at the company at least 6 months, earn an average of $12.24 an hour, which is above that living wage standard. It's not the greatest salary, but it certainly is above that standard. Pay varies depending on the job. For example, new freezer workers earn between $11.25 and $12 an hour. That's right from their materials. What's your response?
Well, I think there's a couple of responses. One is, they're putting out these statistics. It's really hard to figure out exactly who they're counting when they're come up with these averages. They say the average employee in a certain category makes a certain amount. We don't really have a sense of whether that includes the categories that are going to be created through this relocation. Does it include management? Is it the entry-level pieces? Another thing that we know what the jobs are getting posted at. And you've pointed this out in the past. They're posting them at $8.25 an hour, $8.50 an hour, $8.75 an hour. We also know Mayor Bloomberg goes on his radio show to talk about what he perceives as a harm of the new living wage legislation that the city council passed. The city council says if you get more than $1 million in subsidies from the city, then you have to pay what they define as a living wage. Bloomberg goes on and says Fresh Direct was so opposed to paying a living wage that they held up the council's vote on that bill until they could get their inducement resolution from the industrial development.
Before that, we had that dialogue on this show, so that was done. The Fresh Direct situation was resolved to that degree before they did the legislation.
They said if you expect us to pay that living wage, we'd rather go to New Jersey than locate in New York City. Now that doesn't, what they're putting out there, what you're telling us doesn't jive with that. It just doesn't make sense. If they're really willing and able to pay those amounts of money, then they ought to advertise that way, and they ought to make themselves accountable to the living wage legislation. And I would point out, and I alluded to it already, the threshold for that legislation is $1 million. Fresh Direct is getting 127 times that threshold and still not willing to pay the living wage. And I think there's another important piece to put out there, which is Fresh Direct is not a growth industry. Fresh Direct is trying to get a bigger piece of the grocery pie. People are not going to eat more in New York City because Fresh Direct exists. They're just going to get their groceries differently if Fresh Direct is successful. And if you look at the promo materials they're putting out in the South Bronx, they basically tell you that. We want to replace your baker. We want to replace your local grocery store. We offer a better product than they do. Stop using them, start using us. So if you look at the job question from a net perspective, it's not all a win. There's going to be a loss in the brick. For every increment of success that Fresh Direct has, there's going to be an increment of decline from the bricks and mortar grocery stores. And that was never part of the cost-benefit analysis that was done to support the subsidies, and it's not something Fresh Direct talks about when they talk about job growth.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the land and the space and the whole situation with the promise of intermodal transportation, but I have this burning question based on the few things we've already addressed, and I'll ask you, Mr. Carney, what is the motivation here? I mean, obviously Fresh Direct has their own self-interest, but they're not the only ones at play here. There are other, obviously, politicians and others who've lined up to support them. Do you have a sense of what the ultimate objective is? If what you say is true, why would the borough president or why would somebody else say this is a good thing if what you say is true?
You know, that's a great question.
That's why they pay me all this money to ask that question.
None of them have called me up and exposed what's in their heart of hearts to me on this. I think that what we've seen in the recent past in New York City is a subsidization of large-scale development with limited concern for how it affects neighborhood businesses, mom-and-pop businesses. And Fresh Direct is just a continuation of a trend that's been going on for a while. We've seen it at Willard's Point. We've seen it at the Bronx Terminal Market. And so why that is, why there's a preference for it, you know, I think we all have our ideas about how and why politics functions or dysfunctions the way it does, but I think it's consistent with a broader trend that's going on.
We did a show, and many of our viewers know about it, where we examined the entire area. What are the legalities as far as the Gillespie Group's ownership and control of the property? Now, folks may or may not know, they were supposed to have expanded the intermodal transportation concept in that area to benefit the entire region. Clearly, that hasn't been done. Nobody could deny that. But is this Fresh Direct project, if they use environmentally friendly vehicles, isn't this a way of using that land to improve the nature of commerce in that part of the Bronx and the whole Bronx?
So there's a few different legal issues that we're raising with respect to this deal. The environmental issues, basically state law requires that you have to take a hard look at environmental issues. You evaluate them. If you find that any are going to be significant, then you have to mitigate them as much as you can. They didn't do that here. And by deciding not to do it, what they concluded was not only will there not be significant environmental impacts, they said there's no chance that there will be significant environmental impacts. And so we don't even have to study it. We don't have to have public hearings to talk about it. We can just go right from A to Z, and we can push this thing through with its subsidies. So that's one thing that we're challenging. It's not that the environmental law doesn't say you can't do this development. It says if you're going to do it, you have to take a hard look at these environmental issues, and you have to address them. The issue with the land, as folks may or may not know, the Harlem River Yard is actually owned by the state. It's Department of Transportation controlled land. There's a state constitutional requirement. Public land has to be used for a public benefit. The land was leased to the Gillespie Group in 1991 with an intent that it would serve this public benefit of developing what's called an intermodal terminal. It's basically a fancy way of saying freight comes in on rail cars rather than on trucks, and then from the intermodal terminal it gets put on trucks and delivered to its final destination.
But this doesn't, adhere to some of those goals. Ultimately, this is benefiting the public good, providing a new grocer. Mr. Austria, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, it's not for the public good at all. This company, the Harlem River Rail Yards, controlled by the Gillespie Group, over the last, I think it's since they've been there, have collected about, or they've paid about $5 million in rent for that land, which is supposed to be for the public benefit. They've collected about $66 million in rent. And that rent is being collected from Waste Transfer Station, right, from the New York Post, from FedEx. And all of these companies, they're not, except for Waste Management, which is carting out the majority of New York City's waste, the rest of them are running their business using trucks. And so this concept that was actually supposed to decrease the number of truck trips, the amount of diesel fuel that, as everybody knows, this asthma corridor that surrounds the South Bronx, it hasn't been used for that. It's basically been used to support private industry at very low costs, and I think a lot of people's pockets are getting lined with a lot of money for this. Mm-hmm. And who loses out? It's the 80,000 people in our neighborhood a lot of whom live and are breathing this stuff every day.
What do your neighbors say? And be honest with me. There are a number of you who are, listed as complainants on the legal action, but I can imagine there are people who are saying, you know what, I really need a job, and I really need a job as a truck driver, and we have issues here, and I got to feed my family. What is the general feel? If I were to walk down a block and speak to people in some of the homes that line the area, or even some of the buildings down there, people in the Bruckner project that's right there, what would they tell me about this? Would they say, no, we don't want this? Or would they say, you know what, we're not thrilled, but the heck with it, we need the jobs. This would be industry, and this would be a good thing.
Yeah, I think you'd have some people who, are hungry for those jobs and would say, hey man, I need a job, I need any job. But a lot of those people, as we've been out there talking with folks and kind of explaining a lot of the project, people in the South Bronx also are no stranger to their land, to their neighborhoods, to their community being exploited for the purpose of big business. And so as we start to talk to folks about, well, think about the Yankee Stadium deal, and think about the amount of contracts that were supposed to go to minority and women-owned business enterprises. Think about who was supposed to be hired for that. For a lot of people, it kind of resonates with them that the promises that have been put out there to benefit the community, there has not been the type of community benefit that folks have hoped for. And people know that. So once we start to have some dialogue about, this is the effect on the trucks and asthma, and people will start to say, yeah, my kid has asthma. I got 15 grandkids, and 9 of them have asthma, and start to realize this is really not for the community benefit. These jobs are some bones and some crumbs they're throwing to us, but this project was not set up to benefit the Bronx. It was set up to benefit Fresh Direct.
Mr. Carney, just back to the land question. Let's just say you win. Let's just say that, okay, Fresh Direct is not there. Who's fooling who? Are we really ever going to get the Gillespie Group to develop an intermodal transportation in that area? So here you are. I mean, I realize that maybe the legality will show that, well, you're right. They never really did that. So if Fresh Direct doesn't come, you're not expanding. I mean, come on. I've been around the Bronx a long time. You're not expanding the rail area, and you're not improving intermodal transportation, are you? Or will it? Is that possible?
Well, there are a lot of people that think it is possible. I think that, and we're not in a position to make it happen, but the lease that the DOT gave to the Gillespie Group, which was acknowledged at the time as a sweetheart deal, very, very favorable lease terms of the Gillespie Group, justified on the grounds that this intermodal terminal would provide such a great public benefit that they could provide below market rate rents to the Gillespie Group. It requires that if the Gillespie Group can't deliver on that promise of an intermodal terminal, then DOT needs to look at whether that lease is serving its public benefit. And if they're not committed to the land use plan, then DOT has the right to take that land back, and they ought to. And they ought
or are they doing this in a de facto way and saying, well, okay, it's not going to happen, so let's have Fresh Direct?
Well, I mean, that's kind of, basically what they've decided, I guess, is that, what was supposed to be a land use plan that was going to eliminate millions of truck miles from the streets of New York City every year has now become a land use plan for truck-intensive businesses, ironically, Fresh Direct, FedEx, New York Post, and a fossil fuel power plant thrown on top of it. So they've kind of let that happen, but what we're saying is you can't let that happen. This is land that's held in the public's name. It has some restrictions to it. It's not just open for private development. And if the public benefit isn't going to be this intermodal terminal, then let's think about and step back and think about what the public benefit there ought to be.
The suit alleges unfair labor practices. Why don't you, and I guess you began to address it a little bit when you said that, the pie is as large as it's going to be, and they just want a larger piece of it. Talk to me about, that concept and how that applies.
Yeah. So we're not claiming unfair labor practices in our lawsuit, but we have recently had a couple of different associations that represent grocers and represent bodegas come out in support, saying basically, we paid for our stores on our own dime. We didn't get any subsidies in creating our grocery stores and creating our bodegas, and now you want to subsidize one competitor and subsidize them to the tune of $127 million. We can't compete with that. It's fundamentally unfair. It's, as I said earlier, you're not subsidizing somebody who's going to create a new market or a new industry. You're subsidizing somebody who's going to compete with existing grocery stores, bodegas. And this is a city where we're losing these bricks and mortar stores by the hundreds.
I suppose it should be said along those same lines that I understand that Stop and Shop has just expanded its delivery service and its trucking fleet. I would be curious. I'm guessing that they're probably not in favor of it. They're saying, "Hey, we've been in the Bronx for years." What's next? As far as the project goes, and as far as your legal action, give our viewers a sense of timing so they can understand what we're going to be looking for in the newspapers.
Yeah, sure. So we have filed our briefs. We, within the next couple of weeks, are going to get the response to our briefs from the city, from Fresh Direct, from the Gillespie Group, and from the state. And at that point, we'll have some sense of where they come,
Now, they moved, maybe Reverend Austria, you can talk a little bit about it. They moved some trucks that were damaged during Hurricane Sandy, and it would be hard to look at that and say, oh, wow, that was good for the Bronx. Is this their land to use at this point? I mean, do you have a sense of what that's all about?
Well, I'm not
I'm
clear
sure
on all the legalities. I know that we woke up after Sandy and saw about 120 trucks that had been damaged, diesel fuel trucks lying in that land that just kind of appeared there overnight. No discussion about it.
Probably, I'm just guessing it didn't. And Jane, by the way, put up the information for information if you want to contact any of the folks involved here. I'm guessing you didn't look at that and say, wow, good, they're acting in our interest. Seemed to me it was plainly obvious this was just somebody kind of, we need the space, so let's do it.
It felt like, again, the South Bronx was being used as a dumping ground. We called up our lawyers and we said we understood that with this lawsuit being filed, that there would be a moratorium on any of the development of the land or the development of the project until we had gotten through the first stages of this lawsuit. And our lawyers talked to their lawyers, and they said, we're going to get rid of those trucks.
Do they? When would they have the land? Does this need to go through some city council vote?
Yep.
And you have to be quick because we're almost out of time.
Sorry, yeah, there's a few steps it has to go through. It's far from a done deal. The state subsidies need approval. The city subsidies had a preliminary approval. They still need final approval. And one of the things we discovered, we did a bunch of Freedom of Information requests. There's a land use approval process that this needs to go through.
We're going to be tuned into it, and you can certainly come on back. We're sorry that they had turned down their invitation to us to appear. We thank you, Mr. Carney and Reverend Austria, for joining us. And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show, anything going on in the Bronx, then you email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com. You can make a comment on our Facebook page. Please become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. I'm sure these guys will after the show tonight. And next week, we're going to be doing a show about the Kingsbridge Armory, another controversial Bronx project. The people from the group CARA will be joining us, the Kingsbridge redevelopment, Kingsbridge Armory Redevelopment Alliance will be with us. So thank you to Jane, thank you to Dina, thank you to the cast of thousands who are around here, thank you to the gentleman here, and to you.